First of all, I want to say thank you so much to Randy for leading the discussion last week. He did a fantastic job, and I cannot tell you guys how much it means to me to be able to have people to rely on, to know that I can rely on when I'm out of town. It's a huge relief. So very, very helpful to me. So Randy and I had a good conversation about what you guys discussed. I did my best to take my own notes, and hopefully this review is at least somewhat reflective about what you guys discussed last week. Firstly, I wanted to comment on Randy. Randy briefly discussed how the Ten Commandments are kind of split into two categories. They're the commandments toward God, the commandments regarding our relationship with God and our behavior and how we interact with God and the things of God. And then there are the commandments where which govern how we interact with one another. Some people refer to the first four as the vertical commandments and the latter six as the horizontal commandments. Because the first four, you're dealing with your relationship to God, and the last six dealing with your relationship with one another. And so the first four, which we've gone through, and you guys went through, right? Do not have any gods before me. Do not make any images. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, and do not take the Lord's name in vain. Right? Those are the four which relate between us and God, and the rest are our relations with each other. And Randy very rightly reminded us that Christ taught us how to fulfill this law, and it essentially uses the same formula. Right? He said, "What does Christ say we should do, and we will fulfill all the law and the prophets?" Right. Love God, right? With all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And love your neighbor as yourself. Right? Those two. So vertical and horizontal, right? And you need both. You need both. Because otherwise you'll have an incomplete, you won't fulfill all the law. Because if you only love God but didn't love people, which by the way isn't actually possible, you would be maybe fulfilling the first four, but you'd be failing to fulfill the latter six, right? If we only look at the Ten Commandments. But then if you say, well, I love people, but I don't really love God, once again, not really possible, then you'll maybe fulfill the latter six, but not fulfill the first four. And Jesus says, if you fail to fulfill even one, you fail all of them, right? Because they're all in with each other. Right? You can't separate them from one another. They're all together. So that's that wonderful. Jesus has that wonderful way of getting straight to the heart of the law, rather than just understanding the letter of the law. And one thing I wanted to add, as I was thinking about this past couple weeks, one thing occurred to me is that there's another way to look. There's another way of dividing the law, the Ten Commandments, is you have 8 of the Ten Commandments are what could be considered negative commands, in that you shall not, right? It's telling you shall not do something. But then 2 of the commands could be referred to as positive commands. You shall do something, right? And so we have, you shall not have other gods before me. You shall not have carved images before me. You shall not take my name in vain. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not covet. I forgot. I lost count. Anyway, you have 8 that are shall not commands, which implies these are things which people tend to do, and so they should be commanded not to do them, right? If left to your own devices, this is what people, maybe not you individually, but people as a whole, tend towards. And so we need commands to say, don't do this, don't do that which you tend to do. But then you have these 2 commands, which are saying, do this, which implies that people tend to not do this. And if left to their own devices, they will not do this. Now, the 2 positive commands are keep the Sabbath holy and honor your father and mother. Those are the 2 positive commands, the things that people will tend to not do, but must be commanded to do.
That's right.
Right? Now we'll get it. The review gets into both of those two commands, but it's very interesting. That division, that difference was starkly interesting in my mind. That there are certain things which you need to command people to not do because they tend to do, right? Like worship other gods, or make images of God, or murder, or commit adultery, or lie, right? Or steal, or so on, right? All these things which people have a tendency towards. But then the two things which people tend to ignore, right? Which is honoring the Sabbath and honoring your father and mother. So that was very interesting. That was very interesting. So the first thing you guys got through 3 commandments. Good job. The first commandment you hit in my absence, which by the way, all of these I was like, oh man, I really wish I was there for the discussion of these, because these are just so interesting to me. Was in chapter 20, verse 7. You shall not take the Lord's name in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Now that's quite a statement, right? There's no other command which has that phrase. The Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Now, we must first identify that word take, because people often say, people will often kind of summarize this as in, don't say, oh my God, right? Or something like that. Like, you've taken the Lord's name in vain. Sure, you could say that, but there are 2 problems I have with that, right? One, God is not his name. We can start with that. God is his title. People refer to him as God, but that's not his name, right? So we should start there. Maybe it's a technicality, and we'll get into this a bit more today in our discussion. But God really knows your heart in all that you do, so you should still probably be careful about it. But the other part is the term take, right? People misunderstand what the term take. It's better translated as carry or bear, right? To carry or to bear, which Randy got into a bit.
Use the word forge.
Well, we'll get into that because I thought that was a fantastic analogy. But it has this connotation of carrying a banner into battle. So a troop would carry a banner to signify what troop they belong to or what nation they belong to or so on. It was carrying the authority of their nation. And so if they did something, so you could consider like a U.S. soldier wearing the uniform, that's a version of carrying the banner or bearing the reputation of a country. And so when a U.S. soldier does something they should not or does something wrong while in uniform, it doesn't just affect them, it reflects poorly on the entire nation and on the government and on the military because they're bearing the uniform. They're representing something. Go ahead. Ambassador.
For other countries, when we send our American ambassadors out to other countries, they better not misrepresent what the president wants.
That's right.
Or they can actually lose their life for that.
Oh yeah, right. And so when we talk about the idea of taking the Lord's name in vain, the reason the Lord has such a serious ramification, which is I will not hold them guiltless, right? Is because what it means is when you misuse his name, when you misrepresent his name, right? And so when you want to know what does it mean to take the Lord's name in vain, it means when you misuse or misrepresent his name or his character, when you claim his name as a way to add authority to your own words or your own ideas, and when you employ his name the same way you would employ a cuss word, right? Why would you use his name as a cuss word? That's a big question, right? And as Dad brought up a second ago, Randy had an excellent analogy, right? The idea of forging someone's signature, right? The idea of forgery, right? Which is, I think, just the perfect way to think about it. If I was to go to a bank and I was like, I wanted to take out a loan, and I used Randy's name and Randy's information, I forged his signature, right? That would be criminal, because I am misrepresenting Randy's desire or will. I'm misusing misusing authority which I'm claiming, but I don't actually have, right? I'm attempting to do something in the name of someone else who has not given me permission to do that, right? And you go to jail for that, right?
Yeah.
But when you do that with God, right? So the penalty of doing that is kind of dependent on the authority of the person you're attempting to misrepresent, right? Because if I did it to Randy, I might go to jail, depending on what I tried to use his name for. But if I did that with the presidents, if I stole the president's identity, right, and tried to do things using the authority of the president of the United States, you better be sure that penalty is going to be higher than if I just used Randy's. Not that Randy's a lesser person, but the authority Randy exacts is less than that of the president. And so consider how serious it is to try to use God's name as a way to get your way without his consent. You look like you have a question.
Well, do people realize when they say GD that you're cursing what you want?
Right. It's a dangerous thing, right?
I mean, so you better leave him out of it.
So the phrase is to say, it's almost a prayer. Although, once again, understand God knows your intention.
Right.
And so I don't think it is a prayer. Otherwise, we would be in trouble. But it's essentially to say, God, please damn this thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's very dangerous, right?
Oh, yeah.
You got to be careful. Now, once again, God is merciful, and he knows the intention of your heart. So he knows most of the time when people use that, they're not actually asking for that, right? So we should be thankful that God is smart enough to not do things by the letter of the law, if you will. But it's still not. Why would you still shouldn't use anything related to God as a curse word?
Right.
It seems a bad idea, right? But so there's a lot going on there,
Pastor.
ma'am.
I just want to say, when you hear people say, and it's mostly when someone else has made a mistake, oh my God, why did you do that?
Right.
And so when they say it in that term, are you...
So I think it's touchy, right?
Okay.
I don't think it's necessarily taking the Lord's name in vain. Like I said, because one, God isn't his name. But two, what people is the person's intention behind using it. The person is attempting to elicit what's it called?
Deity?
Not quite that, I don't even think. I think it's essentially calling upon that which is highest to express the amount of concern you have.
Okay.
Now, people use it too casually,
Yes.
right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, so it's where I say you need to be careful, because it's one thing where it's like a tremendous thing which has occurred, and you say, oh my God, because it's tremendous, right? And so you're calling upon the highest because something tremendous has occurred. But if it's something very small, and you just constantly throw it in there with everything, then what you're in danger of is making that which is holy, using that which is holy as common.
The Amplified says, you should not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, that is, irreverently in false affirmations or in ways that impugn the character of God.
Right.
And then lower in that it says disregarding its reverence and its power.
Right. So there's a in all ways we should treat the name of God and things related to God as with reverence. And that's not something people tend to do. We tend to be very irreverent with the things of God. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but we're not going to get into that at the moment. So be careful to not misrepresent the intentions and desires of God through what you say and through how you behave. Because if you're a Christian, you are implicitly claiming to be a representative of God's will. So you need to be careful with that. The second point you guys went through, or the second commandment, was the commandment regarding the Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. Now, this, in my opinion, of all the commandments, is the least paid attention to. I think at least for us as a culture, we pay attention to this commandment. We would consider all the other commandments to be necessary, but we treat this one as if it's optional. Because how many of us actually set aside a day to rest and not work? Not many hands went up there, so I'm going to... So, which is crazy, because of all the commandments, this one takes up the most verses. More words are spent on this commandment than any other commandment. We consider thou shalt not murder to be really important, but that's only a few words. This one takes up 3 whole verses. No other commandment takes up that much real estate in the Bible. And yet, we treat this one as the least important. Furthermore, you could consider this to be the real first commandment, because this was a command before they even had the 10 Commandments. And this was established at the beginning of all things. Before we had anything, God established the precedent of resting on the Sabbath. Not because he was tired, but because he was in the act of creating. And as a part of the act of creating, he considered it important enough to create a precedent of rest. Now, people get very legalistic about this, and that's incorrect. But it's also incorrect to ignore it. It's established as a principle. And there's something to be discussed about God's concern for your health, because God does have concern for your health, right? And it is healthy by all metrics to take a break, to rest a day out of your week. It is healthy, but it's more than that, right? This command is more than just a concern of your health. It's a matter of trust. Because you're trusting that I'm going to take a break from working on stuff, and it'll be okay that I take a break from working on stuff. I'm not going to lose anything by just not working on stuff today. God is strong enough to provide for me this day if I'm not working today. Right? It's a matter of trust. It's a matter of sacrifice. Because you are sacrificing your work for a day. And that is a sacrifice. Understand? And it's a matter of giving glory to God. Because let me tell you something that we glory in. We glory in our work. We find a lot of glory in what we can produce.
We identify.
Yeah, exactly. We identify by our work. But there's one day out of every week which God says, don't work. Don't work for your own glory today. Instead, rest in my glory. Glorify my name. Set this aside for me.
Do you believe that, could you say that like, cause the natural, the world in jobs give us off days?
Yeah. So that
probably derived from that, maybe.
Yes. So in Christian
More
nations,
natural, not spiritual.
in nations which are traditionally Christian, the idea of a Sabbath was enforced, right? Largely by the Catholic Church to begin with, and then it became a tradition thereafter, you know. But then there are periods of history where it was less attended to, and periods of history where it's more attended to, and it's also dependent on your culture and your region, right? So in the South, people, like, even during the Industrial Revolution, it was less common for people to work on a Sunday than it was in the northern states, right? Because there's a different culture, right? And the northern states would consider the southern people to be lazy, and the southern people would consider the northern people to be cold, and all kinds of, you know, things like that. But then, after the Industrial Revolution, came a period of people fighting for workers' rights. And so that's where we get the 8-hour workday instead of the 16-hour workday. That's where you get child labor laws. That's where you get 5 days a week instead of 7 or 6 days a week, right? Usually it would be 6 days a week, and then people would be off on Sunday. That was typical.
Sometimes when I worked for the Army PS, but we would close on Sundays.
Yeah.
The commissary would close on Sunday, and then some more businesses on the outside, all over close on Sunday.
Right.
And then we didn't even have night work. So
Right.
all that changed back then. It might have started before then, but when I was working, it started all that.
Right.
And now my job, all of them were saying,
Right.
but we got paid. I started not mine because I got paid double.
Now,
I
it's
got paid.
well, it's something that we should expect from the world, right? Because
Only
the
thing
world-
I like was Sundays was.
yeah, the world doesn't do it for religious reasons,
Mhm.
but we should,
We should.
right? We should keep in our minds that whether you consider Saturday or Sunday to be your Sabbath, it's honestly not that big a deal which. Whichever day you have committed to be that Sabbath, you stick to it. Stick to it. Even when it's inconvenient to do so.
Right.
You know, because if you only did it when it was convenient, then it's not a worship.
Right.
It's not obedience. It's not sacrifice. It's not submission. So, point number 3 you guys went over was the commandment of honor your father and mother, which is another very important commandment, because it's the first commandment that has a promise attached to it, right? Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord God is giving to you, right? And Paul reminds us that it's the first command with a promise. I think he reminds us in Ephesians, if I remember right. Randy discussed how family relationships are the foundation of any society. Any society is built upon the family unit. And if the family structures are weak in any given society, that society will end up being weak. Right? Because you have to have that familial relationship. And this is historically proven out. And so if you have families where the children give no honor to their parents, I got news for you. That's a weak structure. Right? A family can only function well if the children honor their parents. Otherwise, everything will devolve into chaos.
And that means also always, never, I don't care what age you get to do, some of the children, well, I'm grown now, I don't have to do, yes, you will do it, even me, I
Right.
still honor my mother and father and everybody, even when I was old, I didn't never say because I'm 18,
Right.
but you should honor them all the time.
Yeah.
All the time.
The command doesn't give an age limit.
It doesn't give an age limit, no,
It doesn't even say until they're dead.
Right.
Even after they've died, still you honor your father and your mother, right? And what people, so honored, yeah, way in the back.
Dad wanted me to read it from the Amplified.
Sure.
It says honor, respect, obey, care for.
Care for.
Care for your father and your mother,
Right.
so that your days may be prolonged in the land the Lord your God gives you.
That's right. Yeah. And I was just about to say, what people honor does not necessarily mean obey, right? And by the way, it doesn't necessarily mean love. Just to point out. And it doesn't mean like. It means respect, value, and as Mom said, care for. You treat them as they are valuable, right? That they are important. That doesn't mean you like them, which makes it easier for some people, because there are plenty of people who don't like their parents, right? There are plenty of people who have parents that are honestly unlikable.
But they love. Can they love them and like
They can love them in Christ, right? And I'll get to that in a second. But this command is focused on treating them with respect and with value, right? Even if you don't like them. And here's the hard part, even if they don't deserve it. Because that's where the metal hits the road with this particular command. Because it doesn't give this is not a conditional command. It doesn't say honor your father and mother if they've earned it. If they deserve it. It just says honor your father and mother. Flat out. End of statement. Right? That's the command. And it's difficult. This becomes difficult when you don't feel that they deserve it. Right? Because, let's be honest, parents fail sometimes to be the parents they should be. Whether they're good parents or bad parents, right? There are good parents and bad parents. But the command is not conditional on whether they are a good parent or a bad parent. It just says, honor them. Not for who they are as a person, but for who they are as a position. Right? You respect and value them for being your father and your mother.
Right.
Now, that's a difficult thing, and people will ask, how can you do that? And I'm not going to take the time to lay out a whole thing, because that's a whole nother sermon on its own. But I'll say this: our obedience to God is never conditional upon the behavior of others. Your obedience to God should never be conditional upon the behavior of others, right? If you tell your child to do something, and then they say, but my sister said, or my sister did, you're going to say, I don't care what they did or said. What did I tell you? And the same is true for honoring your parents. Rest assured that every parent will be judged by God and held accountable for what they did with what God gave them. But every child will also be held accountable to God for whether they honored their parents. And I got news for you. If you come to God and say, but they did this and they said that, He's going to say, I'm not asking you about them. I'm asking what you did.
People have that bad too. I used to do that once in a while, but worry about what you. Don't worry about that person.
That's right. That's right. Right. If
they
you're
did, that don't mean I can do it.
if your behavior is dependent upon what someone else has done, you've made them your master.
Right.
Right?
Well, Jared, we don't like everything that God wants us to do.
Sure enough.
But I think mainly He is saying through all of it, He is in the high position, and we're to honor those things.
Right.
I think in everything He's trying to say, it's not what we want.
Right.
I don't like some of the things He asked me to do, but I'm not going to hate Him.
Right.
I'm not going to consider Him a bad father.
Right. And if you have parents who are telling you to do things against the will of God, you don't obey them, but you still honor them. Right. You don't disobey them in a way to disrespect them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, understand, it can be very hard. It is very hard to honor someone who you don't feel is honorable. To respect someone who doesn't treat you with respect. Right? To love someone who is hurting you. But I got news for you. If you're in that position, not only are you commanded to honor them, you're commanded to love them. Jesus tells us in Matthew 5, love your enemies.
And that's why I'm going to
Pray for those who persecute you.
It's
Do
tough.
good to those who spitefully use you.
Yeah. It's tough.
So you have an obligation beyond what you feel.
So would it be appropriate to say that the more difficult it is to obey this commandment, the greater your life and your quality of life, the longer your life?
I don't know if I could say that out of hand, but I could say that would be a reasonable expectation, right? So this command can be very hard, and that's why I think there's a reward. Well, that's one reason why there's a reward. Because most times, a reward is you get more out of what you invest more into, right? And so, and this requires a lot of investment, especially if it's difficult to do. And you know, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake." And to honor a parent who is dishonorable, it can be physically abusive, right? But to do so is, one, to be blessed, and two, yours is the kingdom of heaven. So it can be very difficult, but that's why there is a reward attached to it.
I also think it's due to the one word, obedience.
Yeah,
You know, obedience is better than sacrifice.
that's right.
But think about it in terms of hard things.
Right.
It's always hard to obey in doing what's right.
That's right.
But when you obey in what is right, there's more rewarding in that.
That's right.
Even though it's hard, and it's across the board. That's a principle.
Yeah.
Across the board, you apply it to anything, whether it's your job, whether it's your relationships with someone, boss or whatever. When you're the one that's doing the right thing, even if it's something that's hard,
Right.
I think it was really difficult for Jesus to obey God's final command to him on this earth.
Sure.
But the reward that we all receive from that
you
Right.
see,
is
Right.
and that love also is a major part. Like you're saying, even if you don't like it, and Sister Teresa pointed out, even if you don't like something, but what does God say? You have to love, and then you go into 1 Corinthians 13 to find out what true love is. And when you read all those things, patience, kindness, bears all things, doesn't hold grudges and envy and all of that. And then you look at honoring your mother and father, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
Love is wrapped up in all of that honor and all of that respect. It's wrapped up in there. So you can't get away from that. Just like we're saying the Ten Commandments holds on those two.
Right.
Wrapped in there, all those other ones are wrapped into the two.
Right.
Honoring your mother and father. Love is wrapped into it all.
That's
God's
right.
kind of love is wrapped into it all.
That's right.
So no matter what we do in life, we can't get around true love.
That's right.
That's always going to be in it. God's kind of love is always going to be wrapped into what we do, how we relate.
Right. Well, and that's what you guys talked about last week in a quick review.